You've probably heard the horrifying claims about what Roman soldiers did to captured queens, stories of brutal torture, public executions, and unspeakable violations that make your stomach turn. But here is the shocking truth that historians have been trying to tell us. Almost everything you think you know about Rome's treatment of defeated queens is wrong, and the real story is far more calculated and disturbing in ways you never expected. The internet is flooded with sensationalized accounts of Roman conquest, painting vivid pictures of sadistic legionnaires dragging royal women through the streets, subjecting them to every imaginable horror before their inevitable execution. YouTube videos rack up millions of views with titles promising to reveal the dark secrets of Roman brutality toward female rulers. Social media posts describe graphic scenes of torture chambers and public humiliations that would make even the most hardened historians wince. The narrative is always the same. Rome was a merciless war machine that showed no mercy to its enemies, especially powerful women who dared challenge imperial authority. This myth has become so entrenched in popular culture that most people accept it without question, assuming that ancient warfare meant automatic death sentences for defeated royalty. But when you actually dig into the historical records, consult the writings of Roman historians like Tacitus and Cassius Dio, and examine archaeological evidence from triumphal processions, a completely different picture emerges. The truth is simultaneously less grotesque and more psychologically sinister than the legends suggest. Let's start with the most famous example that gets twisted beyond recognition: Queen Zenobia of Palmyra. In 272 CE, this remarkable woman had carved out an empire stretching from Egypt to Anatolia, directly challenging Roman authority in the east. When Emperor Aurelian finally crushed her forces and captured the queen, everyone expected her execution. The sensationalized versions of history claim she was paraded naked through Rome, tortured, and eventually killed in the Mamertine Prison, where Rome's enemies met their end. Here's where it gets interesting. According to the Historia Augusta and other contemporary sources, Zenobia was indeed displayed in Aurelian's triumphal procession, but she wore golden chains so heavy that Persian attendants had to help her carry them. She was adorned with precious jewels and dressed in royal garments that emphasized how far she had fallen from power. But then, something unexpected happened. After the triumph concluded and the crowds dispersed, Aurelian didn't execute her. Instead, he granted Zenobia a villa near Tivoli, outside Rome, where she lived out the rest of her days in comfortable retirement. She even married a Roman senator, and her descendants became part of Roman aristocracy. The woman who had defied Rome for years ended up living in luxury, dining with the very people she had fought against. This wasn't mercy. It was something far more calculated. Now this is where researchers were stunned when they compared male versus female captive treatment. When Roman generals captured enemy kings or male military leaders, execution was almost guaranteed. Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who led a massive rebellion against Julius Caesar, was held in the Tullianum prison for 5 years before being strangled as the finale of Caesar's triumph. In 46 BCE, Simon Bar Giora, leader of the Jewish resistance, met the same fate after being paraded in Emperor Vespasian's triumph. The pattern repeats throughout Roman history. Male leaders were seen as ongoing military threats who needed permanent elimination. But queens and female rulers presented a different opportunity for Roman propaganda. Dead martyrs could inspire continued resistance, but a living queen, reduced to dependence on Roman generosity, sent a more powerful message. She became a walking advertisement that even the mightiest rulers could be absorbed into. Roman civilization, once they accepted their place in the hierarchy, Zenobia's comfortable exile wasn't kindness. It was psychological warfare aimed at future generations of potential rebels who would see that defiance led not to glorious death, but to irrelevance. Here's the twist almost everyone gets wrong about Boudica, the British queen whose story gets mangled more than any other. Popular accounts describe her capture and brutal treatment by Roman soldiers. After her failed rebellion in 60 CE, the reality completely flips this narrative. Boudica was never captured by Rome. The atrocities committed against her happened before her rebellion, not after. Her husband, King Prosotagus, had tried to protect his kingdom by making the Roman emperor care alongside his daughters. When he died, Roman officials ignored this arrangement entirely. They flogged Queen Boudica publicly, and her daughters were raped by Roman soldiers in a calculated act of humiliation designed to demonstrate Rome's dominance over the Iceni tribe. These weren't random acts of violence by undisciplined troops. They were deliberate policy decisions made by colonial administrators to break the royal family's authority in front of their own people. But this is the part most people never hear. This treatment sparked one of the most devastating rebellions in Roman Britain's history. Boudica raised an army that destroyed 3 major Roman settlements, including Londinium, killing an estimated 70 to 80,000 people. When she finally faced the Roman legions in open battle and lost, she didn't fall into enemy hands. According to Tacitus, she took poison rather than face capture, denying Rome the propaganda victory of parading her in chains. The Roman soldiers never got a chance to treat the captured Queen Boudica as a prisoner because she chose death over that fate. Everything you've heard about her torture and execution after capture is historically backwards. The psychological manipulation extended beyond individual queens to how Rome structured its entire triumph ceremony. When a general celebrated a triumph, the highest military honor Rome could bestow, the spectacle followed a precise formula designed for maximum propaganda impact. The procession moved through the streets of Rome, displaying captured treasures, exotic animals, painted scenes of battles. And finally, the prisoners themselves. Captured royalty marched at the front of the prisoner column, still wearing their royal garments to emphasize the magnitude of their fall from power. The crowd's reaction was carefully orchestrated. Thousands of Roman citizens lining the streets to jeer and celebrate the humiliation of their former enemies. But here's what the sensationalized accounts miss. The Romans rarely killed female captives during or after these processions. The male military leaders would be taken to the Mamertine Prison at the ceremony's conclusion and executed by strangulation, their deaths marking the triumph's finale. Queens and royal women, however, usually survived the day. They were either released into comfortable exile, like Zenobia, married off to Roman allies, or occasionally returned to their homelands under Roman supervision. The uncertainty itself served as psychological torture, forcing defeated rulers to walk through hostile streets, not knowing if they would see sunset. But the actual outcome for female royalty was surprisingly often long-term survival rather than execution. Cleopatra represents the exception that proves the rule, and her story reveals exactly why Rome preferred living captive queens to dead ones. When Mark Antony's forces collapsed and Octavian's troops surrounded Alexandria, Cleopatra barricaded herself in her mausoleum. Octavian wanted her alive desperately because he planned to parade Egypt's queen through Rome in what would have been the most spectacular triumph in Roman history. He sent soldiers to force entry and specifically ordered them to prevent her suicide. They almost succeeded, confiscating weapons and carefully searching her chambers. But Cleopatra understood Roman propaganda better than most. She knew that walking in chains through Roman streets, being reduced from the powerful ruler of Egypt to a chained curiosity for Roman crowds, would destroy not just her dignity, but the entire legacy of Ptolemaic Egypt. So she chose the asp, the symbol of Egyptian royalty, as her method of suicide. Some modern historians, like Pat Brown, have controversially suggested she might have been murdered by Romans who then staged the suicide, but most evidence supports that she denied Octavian his prize intentionally. Her death was actually a defeat for Rome's propaganda machine. Octavian had to settle for parading an effigy of Cleopatra in his triumph instead of the living woman, a significantly less impressive display that everyone recognized as a consolation prize. Cleopatra's suicide proves that Romans valued living captive queens specifically because their continued existence served imperial messaging in ways executions could not. The legal framework underlying these practices reveals the calculated nature of Roman conquest. Prisoners taken in war became property of the Roman state under the principle of post liminium, which governed the status of persons and property captured from enemies. Women of royal lineage discovered that their former power meant nothing once chains replaced crowns. They entered a system where their treatment depended entirely on their propaganda value. If keeping them alive and comfortable encouraged other kingdoms to surrender peacefully, they lived well. If making an example of them served Roman interests better, they could face the same execution as male captives, though this remained relatively rare. The Romans had essentially created a sophisticated calculus of cruelty, where immediate violence took a backseat to long-term psychological and cultural domination. They understood that a broken queen living in Roman luxury sent a more demoralizing message to potential rebels than a martyred queen whose death could inspire resistance for generations. The real horror wasn't random sadistic violence, but systematic psychological domination. Queens who had commanded armies and governed kingdoms found themselves reduced to ornamental captives, their survival dependent on Roman approval. Their former authority transformed into a cautionary tale for anyone considering resistance. Some, like Zenobia, adapted and lived comfortably. Others, like Boudica, chose death over that fate. But the stomach-turning truth isn't about physical brutality. It's about an empire so confident in its power that it could afford to let its defeated enemies live knowing their survival served imperial interests better than their deaths ever could. Rome didn't need to kill captive queens because it had perfected something more efficient, turning them into arguments against rebellion itself. That calculated cruelty, that transformation of mercy into another weapon of conquest, reveals more about Roman imperial psychology than any torture chamber ever could. What myth should I break down next?